my name is Chiara. I work at Julie's Bicycle. We are a charity that has spent over 13 years empowering the music industry, performing arts, culture, and wider creative community to take climate and ecological action. And we do that by bringing people and networks together, sharing and researching what the issues are and what works, co-creating action, and supporting new leaders and voices in this space. Julie's Bicycle, along with Chris Johnson from Cambay Events, Shambala Festival, Equilibrium, and lots of other hats, are founding members of the Outdoor Events Vision 2025 Community Pledge and Network. And our third guest today is Christopher Jones from the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research at Manchester University, where he's a research fellow helping to transfer research from the group into policy, industry, and community application. By the way, I've known Chris Johnson for something like 8 years now and was still thrown a little bit by trying to keep my Johnsons and my Jones straight while preparing the slides and brief for today's session. So it's, yeah, me and many Chris's. So in a parallel world, this week would have been the start of COP26, the 26th UN International Climate Change talks in Glasgow. Because of the pandemic, those talks have been postponed by a year, but climate and environmental justice and action remain as urgent as they were. Although lockdown has meant a temporary dip in carbon emissions around the world, they rebounded very quickly, even as life is anything but back to normal for most of the people on this call, because a temporary pause is not long-lasting change unless we make it. So a really quick opening poll just to get everyone feeling a bit connected with what's going on. So during the pandemic, have you felt more connected to others around the world as part of a creative climate movement? Have you felt more isolated or alone in your climate or environmental work? Or has the lockdown not really affected how connected you feel to others? We'll give you a minute or so to respond to that. Great. So for most of you, you've actually been feeling quite connected to others in this moment in time. So hopefully today is another opportunity, I think, to act on those connections and to really come together and share our experiences. For those of you who have felt more isolated or alone, again, you are hopefully feeling a little bit more connected as part of this whole group that's coming together today. And for those of you who haven't really felt like lockdowns had much of an impact on your climate and environmental work, brilliant work. And hopefully today will inspire you to keep up some of that momentum and keep going. Pardon me. So as a quick reminder, the Outdoor Event Vision 2025 pledge is a commitment to reducing waste where possible, aiming for 50% or more recycling rates, reducing our reliance on fossil fuels where possible, and aiming to reduce annual diesel consumption by 50% or more by 2025, working with audiences, suppliers, and artists to positively influence travel choices and reduce travel-related emissions, and working with our supply chain to improve accountability and the sustainability of food sourcing, working together as an industry to share experiences, both positive and negative, about the changes we're making, and working towards industry standards where appropriate, and measuring key impacts using credible methods to measure progress. This year's pause means a moment to reflect, but I think it's also meant an interruption in some of this work for many of us. So we ran the annual Outdoor Event Industry Green Survey like every year, but of course we didn't have a season to report back from. But the positive news is that despite the pandemic and despite the lockdown, event organisers are still committed to environmental action. 1 in 3 actually said that their experience of this year has made the environment a higher priority. There is a lot of uncertainty out there, concern about how the financial fallout from this year's season is going to impact our ability to invest in environmental initiatives, whether long-term shifts like audiences being wary of public transport is going to harm chances of progress, and just how to plan for this continued uncertainty that everyone's finding themselves in. Related to today's topic, absolutely all respondents said that they think it's important for their events to aim for net zero emissions, but actually less than half of respondents said that that concept has actually informed their approach to sustainability at their events to date. Just over half of respondents still don't really measure their environmental impact, and that's among some of the first steps to take of how you back up a net zero commitment with action. In terms of priorities, energy use is the second highest priority. It does lag behind still managing waste, which remains the top priority for outdoor events organisers. And overall carbon emissions is the third priority, jointly along with audience communications, campaigns and engagement on environmental issues. The main driver for environmental action above everything else that you are all reporting back to us for 4 and 5 events, it's the internal commitment of the company, staff or festival team. Audience expectations is a clear second but quite distant secondary driver. And interestingly enough, local authority requirements is still very low on the list of drivers. So all those climate emergency declarations from local councils haven't quite translated into policy that touches us as outdoor event organisers yet. So we know that this year has been really challenging for the events community, but that break in business as usual, we have to take it to change things. And we know the amount of energy and resourcefulness that's here in this community, and we can see it from the commitment that's coming back in the survey and all of you who are on this call ready to learn from each other and work together looking forward. And with that, I'm going to pass on to Chris from the Tyndall Centre.
Great, thanks Chiara, and thanks for inviting me today. So I'm been asked to talk about a piece of work that we're doing with band Massive Attack, who have initiated and supported the research that we're doing on live music. We come to this more from a generic understanding of climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's very much our background as the Tyndall Centre. Just get the click forward. We're about 20 years old now, doing a range of stuff on climate change specifically, but the part that I think is particularly interesting for the work we're doing with Massive Attack is that around the understanding of climate impact and what that means for sectors who are transitioning to a low carbon low carbon future, the kind of future that's consistent with the outcomes that we want for the climate as a whole. The big bit of framing around everything we do essentially is atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions and concentrations, and that's the ultimate thing that we're particularly interested in as researchers. You may be familiar with the Paris Climate Change Agreement and a lot of the talk around climate change recently around 1.5 degrees of global warming, the International Panel on Climate Change, which some of my Tyndall Centre colleagues are contributors to, doing a lot of work to understand what levels of change something like 1.5 degrees of warming or limiting climate change to a particular level, what that means for us in terms of our energy system, in terms of our agriculture, in terms of the parts of human life that contribute to the global warming that we've seen so far. And there's a very clear story that comes out from all that analysis. It's a story of rapid change. We've seen for the past 30 years that climate change has been on the international agenda, going back to the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. CO2 emissions have increased essentially every year since then. And that's a trend that essentially has to be thrown into reverse, and quite rapidly. So the analysis that we have at the moment suggests that emissions need to be falling globally now, and to reach zero, or ideally go below zero with carbon removal technologies somewhere around the middle of this century. And if you're keeping track, that's coming up on us quite quickly. So we're talking about a major change in global emissions of carbon dioxide and other gases within the next 30 years. The other bit of important context there is that there's an understanding that that's against the backdrop of development in a lot of other parts of the world, and therefore expectation is that industrialized developed countries, which the UK fits within the basket of, there's an expectation that we will change even more quickly than that global average change. So it's against this backdrop of a global challenge. And really what this kind of project is about is sort of translating that global challenge down to a particular set of stakeholders and a particular set of activities, which in this case is live music and live events, the live arts. The other important thing about that framing as well is that that's a global picture. So there's very little room there to transfer emissions from one sector to another, because the whole trend has to come down to zero or below zero, net zero, net negative, as it's sometimes referred to, by that sort of mid-century point. So it's not just a signal for rapid change, but it's a signal that the change has to be internal to each sector. So the sector itself has to change, and that limits what we can do around credits and other forms of mechanisms to balance emissions elsewhere. And it very much frames the scientific or the technical constraints on what we expect for the future to meet our goals on climate change. The UK specifically has now what's called a net zero target for emissions, for all greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and this is in response to these international agreements such as the Paris Agreement. And net zero is a term that really wasn't around if you go back 3 or 4 years. It's quite a new term. It's sometimes shrouded in a little bit of mystery what the net part of it means. Obviously, in basic terms, we understand net, where we're looking at the balance between ingoings and outgoings. But for the energy sector and for sectors that most of their impact for climate change perspective is down to energy use, whether it's for transport or buildings, in particular power supply, it's actually quite simple, because net zero greenhouse gas emissions largely means almost no, or actually no, carbon dioxide emissions, which are about 98% of energy related emissions. You can see the barely registers on that figure, which is showing what emissions in the future will look like by 2050 to be net zero. And it also means that for the sectors that are particularly useful for something like live music and events, or surface transport, power supply, and buildings, those emissions, which are in this graph here with the little star thing above it, a little orange star, they're essentially down to zero or very negligible. So essentially no emissions from surface transport, power, and buildings. So that's heating and other things that happen in buildings that aren't to do with electricity. So net zero by 2050 for the UK, for industries that primarily use energy, that's their main source, means zero emissions in the most simple terms. And that's obviously going from the backdrop of where we are now to a significant transformation to essentially remove all fossil fuel use, certainly fossil fuel use without any form of carbon capture, and to make that zero by 2050 at the latest. That's a legislative target, and sort of the national legal target. Going ahead of that again, though, we've done some work for local authorities within the UK, combined and local authorities, who've asked us what does a local target for their particular area look like for meeting the Paris Agreement. And again, local authorities have been talked about as key partners in live music and other live events. So there's a backdrop there of trying to understand what a city like Manchester does, or what, in this case, we've got an example of the West Midlands Combined Authority, who's another combined authority we worked with. They're trying to understand what their pathway should look like, align with this global ambition. How do they downscale that global picture down to their area? And that, again, it points to a major change in that sense. Their Paris-aligned trajectory reaches zero ahead of 2050. In this case, it's around 2042 is where they set their ambition to reach zero emissions from energy use within their within their boundary. That sounds a bit abstract, but that basically means major changes to transport and how energy is used in buildings, whether that's the electricity supply or the supply for heating and cooling and catering. All those emissions essentially become zero before 2050. And not only is where they get to by that date significant, but we also know that it's the sum total of all the emissions that we put into the atmosphere that really make a difference, not just where we are at a given time. So it's not only that nationally and locally we need to have our ducks in a row by 2040 or 2050, but that significant progress is demanded by a day like 2025, and certainly by 2030. We have to be well on the road to a low carbon transition if we're going to see the benefits of these emissions reductions, this limiting of the total change in the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases. So it's very much a picture there of significant transformation within the next couple of decades. That's really the backdrop which we look to any sector. And live music, and I put live music here because it's primarily the thing we're focused on, but obviously this could be applied to any sort of live, it could be applied to particularly where that CO2 emissions from energy use, transport, streams that we're particularly concerned with here. And those three vectors in particular, highlighted by previous work you'll see from Julie's Bicycles and others, have highlighted that it's these three sectors in particular that are key for these greenhouse gas emissions. So that's what we've been particularly looking at for what the sector might need to do to transform itself from its current state, which is like every other sector of the UK economy, relatively high carbon, to something which is zero carbon. But it's also about understanding that none of those three spokes in the triangle are separate. They're all interrelated, and they all have relationships and established norms, so established ways of doing things that in the process of moving to zero carbon are likely to be disrupted and need to be reconfigured in some way in order to move them from what they are now to where they need to be as a low carbon or zero carbon version of that activity. So I'm just going to give a bit of an example of some of the stuff we've been doing with Massive Attack. This work has been sort of a bit of a hiatus due to COVID, like a lot of things in life at the moment. But we've been able to look at some of the key things, and some of these are essentially the kind of the obvious things, but we've sort of been building the tools to understand them a bit more clearly. So we've been looking at things like how modal shift in band travel, optimizing tour schedules, what that means for carbon change. So looking at extreme examples. So if all travel was done by flight, by airplane, and using the current scheduling approach, compared to if everything was done by train and there was an optimized travel plan. When I say optimized there, I mean the fewest number of miles between venues. So this can highlight the potential change in emissions between these activities. So obviously the higher up the bar this goes, the more carbon dioxide emissions from the tour related to this activity. And obviously there's a big difference there between the biggest bar and the lowest bar. We also understand that people aren't intentionally going for the highest carbon option out of choice. Typically, there's a whole ecosystem of decisions and relationships around that, and the reason why, you know, bands move around the continents in a what way looks like a bit strange if you were looking at the shortest route, and why that's not the case. So it's not only understanding what the potential is, but then also understanding what's behind the current situation and what needs to be reconfigured to get the lower carbon alternative outcome as well. So we can start to quantify some of these benefits, but then also start thinking about the narrative that goes behind that change. Similarly, something like equipment transit, obviously the fewer trucks you move between venues, that has a direct correlation with the reduced emissions. Primarily, as it takes a long time to transition to a low or zero carbon mode of transport for moving equipment like this. So for obvious reasons, a band that only move themselves and some of their key instruments and don't move with a large ensemble of equipment, the impact is a lot lower. And we can quantify that difference. But then again, the question is, what's the alternative and how do you provide that experience using on-site resources? Is there a change there that needs to happen with the way equipment is leased and sort of provided for shows? But at least it can quantify, steps have been taken to at least quantify the benefit of taking that action, even if we're not 100% clear on how that action will be manifested. And similarly with energy use at venues, this is an issue I know that Chiara and others have been looking at in a lot of detail, where there are some very obvious steps that we know about. We know that LED lighting is more than 50% less energy intensive than sodium lighting and other forms of old school lighting equipment. But we can also see that lighting intensity can change. So people can improve the efficiency, but also increase the use of lighting. And that won't give us the overall reduction in energy demand. We'll get a bit of a rebound there. So instead of just thinking in terms of efficiency, thinking in terms of lighting intensity and its value to the aesthetic in a more holistic way that targets reducing overall demand, because we've observed from data so far that there's a big difference between a typical show and a high and low energy using show, and understanding what best practices and how to make it the normal across the sector. And like every sector, monitoring and control of energy use is something that's emerging in venues. It's like a lot of sectors we deal with, it's not something people have typically had as a major financial overhead, so it's not something they've particularly invested in up until now. But there's a real benefit we know from across industry in understanding not just your total energy use, but the parts of your venue that are using energy in at what time and in what way, and then targeting that use to control it more, and that can really drive down energy use quite effectively. Putting in place these measures, I think Chiara mentioned at the top there, it's not always, this kind of measuring of energy use is not always in place, but that's the first step along this road. Before we get into the more exciting things like low carbon heating and cooling systems, we know currently that off-grid venues are likely to be higher carbon than on-grid venues, particularly in European countries where grid emissions, so the carbon emissions associated with electricity from plugging into the national grid, get lower and lower, particularly in the UK, for example, where they're almost half the emissions they were back in 2011. And as that increases, we'll increasingly see a difference between off-grid venues that are using diesel generators and other forms of energy provision and grid-connected events. That margin between the two will likely increase. So I think there needs to be consideration there about how off-grid venues can do a job of having renewable microgrids, which are very challenging to implement, or maybe look at ways for grid connection or importing energy in another way. But again, just thinking about there's a national picture, so the national electricity picture is changing. Our venues and other off-grid applications changing as quickly to be as low carbon as well. And finally, we touched on, which I think is probably the most contentious, and maybe not contentious, but it's one of the most ambiguous areas, is around the contribution of audiences to the carbon emissions of live events. There's a massive range, there's a massive potential for diversity between shows, depending on how audience members travel. And this can vary not only between shows, but within shows. So we've seen examples in the literature already highlighting that a small number of attendees could be responsible for the majority of emissions, depending on how they arrive to the show. I've got a bit of an example here from a model we built just to show how audience travel is affected by transport mode and distance. And it's kind of extreme scenarios of showing the difference between a scenario which we call high flyer, where 50% of the audience members take a flight as part of their travel, and then the walking and coming by bike or by tram and rail as the other extreme, showing the difference in emissions from a show, moving audience travel from one mode to another. That kind of illustrates how you can have such big diversity between the audience emissions contribution to a show, just because there's such a massive potential for variation in how people choose to get there. And again, this highlights the potential, but it doesn't necessarily tell us exactly how change will be implemented. Obviously, we can see if everyone was traveling locally, we can see an obvious benefit from shifting them from using diesel and petrol cars to walking and cycling and taking public transit. But it's much more difficult if we think about the internationalization of live events and how people, it's become more of a cultural expectation to see a show as part of foreign travel. So there's clearly a big issue there, not only in the size of those emissions, but also how the sector grapples with managing expectations and engaging with audiences on the former travel. And this is not a job that we think that live venues or even bands themselves can attack directly. There's also a clear role there for the local authority and the local infrastructure provider to help promote and incentivize these forms of travel, and the facilities that are available, and how bands communicate with their audience in terms of those expectations for travel and where they make their show available. There's really a thing that needs a lot of stakeholders to come together and have a dialogue about. But just quantifying the difference in that mode of transport, distance and transport can have on emissions, I think is a useful first step, and that's what we've done so far. So very quickly to wrap up, transport and building energy use is kind of what we're talking about when we talk about net zero means zero emissions. So for those sectors, essentially by no later than 2050 by the UK's national legislation, but earlier based on some local targets, we'd expect live music to be one of those sectors that helps drive that transformation. And that's the change in direct emissions from those activities. So that's without the opportunity to transfer those emissions to somewhere else through a carbon credit or some other mechanism. It has to happen at that point. At some point, those activities have to become zero carbon. And I think through engaging with organizations along the way through this, we've seen that there's an amazing potential in the live music and live event sector to be the leading role in that, not just because of what it can do for emissions itself, but also the way it can transfer that learning into other sectors in a unique way. So it's really great to be involved in the stakeholders who are making progress on this, and I think there's a great way forward for the live arts to really lead this transition to zero carbon in the next decade and a bit. So thank you very much.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Chris. We're going to hold questions for another moment as I hand over to Chris Johnson from Shambala, who's going to talk through a few of the initiatives that Shambala have put in place over the last decade, really. and then we will come back and have questions all in one go. So Chris, over to you.
Great, thanks, Chiara. Thank you, Chris, from the Tyndall Centre. I'm really excited by what you and Massive Attack are doing, particularly from the perspective of looking at this at scale. So from my experience as a festival organizer, we've been looking at our own carbon footprint, and I'm about to talk to you about that. We've been looking at it at industry level with the Vision 2025 project and Julie's Bicycle for some years. But what I find really inspiring about what you guys are doing is looking at it at a city scale, you know, all those stakeholders, local authority, transport systems. And I think that's going to make a valuable contribution to how we can move things forward. We've really found in the festival sector, for instance, that, you know, we might have the best intentions and be able to separate waste on site, but actually an inhibiting factor, of course, is what we can do with waste when it leaves site, and that's when the kind of large-scale stakeholders matter in terms of municipal waste systems, etc. So I'm really excited about that work. I'm going to share screen and bash through a presentation as quickly as I possibly can. I could talk about this for 5 hours. I've got 5 minutes. So here we go. So I'm going to talk briefly about our journey as a festival from what probably is quite typical emissions to 10% of our emissions. We've been on this journey for about 10 years. And briefly speaking, our journey has been to measure everything, get fanatical, pedantic, look at every corner of our festival and measure absolutely everything. Then to establish what our footprint is, to take action to reduce it. I'm going to touch briefly on the key challenges, then I'm going to end with what our stance is on climate investment. I've just thrown this in because I love it. I'm sure some of you have seen it, but if you haven't seen it, it's just, you know, it's a must-know cartoon. This is my sort of quiet celebration for the US election as well. What if it was a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? So hopefully on your screen, that's large enough for you to see. Right, measuring everything. So as a festival, when we committed to this journey, and as has been mentioned by both Chiara and Chris already, we realized that our first step was to measure everything. And we really have measured absolutely everything that we can think of, although things keep revealing themselves. So transport, emissions, waste, travel, energy, basically everything, food, anything we can think of measuring. Even before we knew why we were measuring it, we started measuring it. So I can't go into that any further because of the time restraints, but we don't just measure it, we put it into a tool. And this is Julie's Bicycle's industry green tool. Some of you are probably aware of it already. We've now used this for 10 years, and all the data that we get from measuring, we put into this tool, and it tells us useful things, and then Julie's Bicycle give us a report. And it's on that basis that we know whether we've been successful or unsuccessful with the various and endless tweaks and changes that we've been making over the last 10 years to reduce our carbon footprint. Taking action. So broadly speaking, this is taken 3 approaches. Those of you on this journey will be familiar already. Energy is a big one. So we have made the transition between from fossil fuel, diesel generators effectively, to 100% renewable energy. That's a mixture of wind, solar, new grid connections which we've installed to site, and also HVO fuel. I know that's a complex topic, we can't go there now, but we've done our best to source domestically sourced waste derived fuels. That's not always been possible, but the research in the UK, which some of you are familiar with already, and certainly our experience has been that we've reduced our fuel by 40% with some fairly straightforward changes. I think we've actually reduced fuel use by 50 to 60% now. It's getting hard to find those reductions, but they're still possible, and we still think we're going to squeeze another 10% next year, and that's 7 or 8 years into the journey of making reductions. So typically 1/3 of a festival's carbon footprint is energy, so very much worth tackling. Waste. So priorities around waste have been to reduce waste in the first place. I hope you're familiar with the waste hierarchy, which we follow. So we avoid using materials in the first place, and then we recycle as much as we can. And one of the cornerstones of that has been reuse. This nice photo is people being made extremely happy by the high quality drinking containers they're using. And that has also the byproduct of which has been a much more beautiful festival site, and our audience love it. That's our recycling exchange, where we persuade people to bring us their waste back so that we can recycle it well. It's been a tough journey, this recycling, but I'll talk about that more in a minute. And the third and most significant area of our emissions is travel, of course. So I said that a third of emissions were from energy. That's specifically, in our experience, a third of on-site emissions, including transport from crew and from contractors, but not including audience travel. Typically in the UK, a festival's wider carbon footprint, i.e. on and off-site, would have 80% contribution from audience travel. So it's good. What Chris is talking about from the Tyndall Centre is something we need to engage with, both with bands and musicians, but also with audience. So our journey with regards to transport has been to encourage as high a percentage of our audience towards shared forms of transport as possible. And there are some easy wins with younger demographics, of course, because we can make coaches cheap, fun, easy, first into campsite. There's lots of incentives, and also disincentives by charging for car passes, etc. But we've also found through research that as you might expect, the relationship between some car users and their cars is very inelastic, in the sense that a family would find it difficult to not come in their car. So we've been really drilling into kind of what kind of incentives can start to appeal to those groups who are very reluctant to, for very good reasons, to move on to public transport. Excuse me. Something that we haven't measured but have taken a bold step with is food impact. So it's not part of our reporting because we haven't worked out how to do that. In fact, I'm very interested and involved in finding a methodology which actually starts to include food. But nonetheless, we recognise that food is a huge part of our footprint, our diets, food supply chain. So we've taken meat off the menu, and I think that's made a huge impact. I think something like a 90% impact in our food footprint. This is just for fun. We put Daisy the cow on trial, and this was really to bring an interesting debate around how food literally shapes the world around us and our future, and food's environmental footprint. So we held a mock court case, and this was inspired by the late Polly Higgins, who is famed for founding Ecocide, and we literally had real characters, farmers, environmental scientists, real barristers, arguing over whether the cow is actually the culprit when it comes to food emissions. More on that if you contact me separately. So our key challenges have been, as I mentioned, to persuade people to take forms of shared forms of transport, and we're still working on that. But also it's been a challenge to work with our audience on waste. We've pretty much got the arenas sorted. That was an easy one, by removing most of what would be waste from our ecosystem. But it's been a real challenge to work with the waste that we're left with on campsites, because we don't restrict the waste people can bring on site. So that's work in progress. And the final point for us is climate investment. So our priority and our stance has always been absolutely to reduce emissions as a priority, but also whilst on that journey to balance our emissions by making climate investment. So we make it available for all of our stakeholders, audience, artists, crew, contractors, to balance their emissions. We've also taken responsibility for our emissions, and currently through investments and a partnership with Equilibrium, as a festival, we're about 10 times net positive in terms of our emissions. So we're quite happy that we're contributing to the world in that way. So that's it for me. Thank you, Chiara. Handing back.
Great, thank you, Chris. We are heading towards the end, but I do want to give people an opportunity to ask questions. None of them have come through on the chat, but this is your chance. If you have questions for either Chris or Chris, do put them in the chat. But otherwise, we can come back to them right at the end and just have a really quick summary, I think, of what we have heard from Chris and Chris while you have a quick think. So I'm just going to share this briefly to sort of summarize, I think, some of the things that a zero or low carbon culture means, really focusing on using less energy and being more efficient with the energy that we use, and shifting over to zero carbon energy sources for our buildings and our events. And we know the challenges within that, but I think our challenge from Chris from the Tyndall Centre for the outdoor event industry is just a recognition that diesel generators have to go, and it's just up to the event community now to figure out what and how the timeline looks like to make that happen, both through lobbying for more mains grid connections in our parks and public spaces, in terms of supporting the development and use of battery technology that is charged using renewable energy, and not relying necessarily on drop-in biofuels, because we know that there is a challenge around sourcing enough from sources that genuinely don't help drive deforestation at the other end of the world. We have to be more resource efficient, again, just using less where we can, designing out waste, maximizing resource value, really focusing on travel and transport, both within our own businesses, so making decisions that mean we travel less where we can, and crucially helping our audiences and our partners make those decisions as well. Less meat and dairy, and protecting and enhancing nature and biodiversity where we can, divesting from fossil fuels, so moving pensions and banking, supporting that new creative ecology of suppliers that is popping up to support us in delivering a zero carbon outdoor event sector, working together and crucially engaging all the people that come through our spaces in how they can take action on climate and environment. So we have got a few questions coming through, which we'll come to in 2 seconds. The last thing that I find useful to think about for people is thinking of these spheres of control, which again, both Chris and Chris have kind of come up against in their presentations. So the stuff that's directly in your control, which is, what kind of electricity or power you're using on site. It is what sort of processes you put in place to manage the energy that's being used. It is whether you monitor those generators. In some cases, it is where your event is located in the first place and whether it is well connected to public transport. It is in your control who and where the audiences that you're marketing to are located to. There's the areas of what you influence and what those levers of influence are. So with audiences traveling, it is things like car parking charges, it is things like bundling coach tickets and event tickets. You can influence what your suppliers invest in and who you buy from. And lastly, there's that much bigger picture stuff that you don't control directly, but has an impact on your impacts. And that's things like the investment into public transport infrastructure. So how you're using your voice to go to your local authority and have those conversations. So coming back to some of the questions that are coming through, the possibilities for green touring and working with bands and management in terms of technical materials for stages and so on and so forth. Chris, and also another question, which is about whether you've suggested concrete options for Massive Attack in order to reduce the impact of their tour, and whether those are going to be published. Do you want to pick up on that, Chris?
Yeah, thanks everyone for the questions. So we've been on a bit of a hiatus for about the last 6 months with this, but we do have a series of recommendations that we've made to Massive Attack that they've already begun to, they've kind of already gone off and started to make happen with an event that they're planning to hold in Liverpool, which would have been this year, is now going to be, I think, sometime next year, though I'm a little bit behind the track with that when and how that's happening. But that covers some of the initial things we discussed with them, such as the collaboration with the city on transport, trying to make it. I think as the other Chris mentioned there about those kind of mechanisms for disincentivizing passenger car transport and really incentivizing public transport arrival, making public transport available at the time of the event is happening, which is something that can be a problem when events finish at 11 and public transport sort of winds down then. So tackling some of those issues, also around the trying to think around the energy use on site a bit, but also around the efficiency of audio and lighting equipment. Mentioned there that there's some pretty quick wins on lighting, that there's still some quite older technology that's used in lighting that is a pretty quick win. But the report on that, because we've been on a bit of a pause, the report on that will probably be delayed. I think looking at the other things we've got on the slate as well, probably till early next year now for the fully sort of detailed report. But those basic indicators that are covered in that presentation, which I guess they're pretty obvious things there. That's already kind of circulating now, and they're already putting that into practice. On green touring, I think it's kind of about that issue around how and when bands move can have a big effect. So obviously reducing flights to sort of ratcheting that down as much as possible, and moving less material, which I think is your point there. And we haven't got to the point yet, but I think there's a really great conversation to have with stakeholders about how materials for putting on shows are more locally situated and generic, and then are just recombined in novel ways, as opposed to a band, which is what they currently do, where they hire all the gear in Bristol or somewhere and then move all that gear across Europe or wherever. That's a model that, even with the best will in the world, it's really hard to decarbonize. So looking at those alternatives as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Chris. And then I think one question for Chris Johnson on how you started measuring and recording in the first place.
I guess the first step was very much looking at what industry guidance existed so that we could have an accurate understanding of what constitutes our carbon footprint, what contributes to it and what we measure. And then really we just have a simple checklist now. And that checklist is a list of the data that we need from across our operations that make up our footprint. On the basis of that, we attribute certain data collection to different key members of the team, so the site manager, certain contractors, and it's written into all the contracts that we require that information because it's crucial to how we operate. And then we have an exercise to gather in all the data after the festival. Sometimes it takes a bit of effort to do that, to be honest. Some of the contractors might be slower than others, but the data comes in, and then we use Julie's Bicycle's online tool, and we just put all the data in, and it gives us lovely graphs and bar charts so that we can understand what our footprint is, and crucially, having 10 years worth of data, how it changes in response to tweaks and changes in practice that we've made. Is that granular enough in terms of, like, at the absolute basic level? It's been things like, okay, we need to know how long a generator is running, how much fuel there is, and even some simple tasks like that can prove difficult. Is a generator being delivered with fuel in it already? So you might not get it perfect if these are first steps, but certainly, it's worth getting on the journey.
Thank you, Chris, for sure. And I think on that note, just a reminder as well to everyone that there is lots and lots of help out there, especially if you're just coming at this for the first time. So there's the Show Must Go On report, which we updated early this year, which really runs through all the different environmental impact areas of outdoor events and what you can do. There's the Powerful Thinking Guide, which really breaks down these questions around generator efficiency, how to achieve those 40% or more fuel use reductions from year to year. There is the New Vision 2025 website, which just pulls together so many fact sheets and different guides. The Creative Green tools, which again are free to use carbon calculators. You can sign up, and as long as you pull together that data and information, you can plug it in. There's lots and lots of different guides on specific issues like audience travel. And crucially, there's also, you know, if you've done all those bits, there is paid services and experts out there as well who can help. There's the Creative Green certification, which is what Shambala has been doing for many years. There's companies like Zap Concepts that can help you on energy monitoring and understanding. Chris is for hire. You've got things like a Greener Festival certification, people like Hope Solutions and Green Events. So there's lots and lots of places to turn to, including as well the Vision 2025 sort of community. And if you're not signed up to that newsletter as well, I really encourage you to do that. I think we are running a little bit short in terms of actually going into breakout groups, but I'm really keen in that case maybe that we keep these last 5 to 6 minutes for any more questions, any specific challenges maybe that someone's having, to bring that forward. I think if we haven't got any specific questions, I'm always interested as well in how an event that's coming at this for the first time, sort of what areas you choose to look at first, because as Chris said, there is so much, and Shambala has been working at this for around 10 years. And I'd also be interested actually from hearing from the two Chris's as to what you think is, you know, the first areas to look at as someone who's coming new at this. From my point of view, something about really getting to grips with your energy supply, because again, that's the sort of direct area of emissions that's in your control, that's happening on your site. And the second area is around transport. So understanding in the first place, doing audience surveys, understanding how people are getting to your site, so you can start putting in place those initiatives that help affect that behavior, and also starting to engage with your suppliers and crew and artists almost as a, to be honest, for me, is slightly last in that list of priorities in terms of the power that you're going to have to change any of that, and actually engaging things like suppliers and contractors and the freight and how they're moving all the stuff that you're using to set up your event in the first place. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear from Chris and Chris as well, what your thoughts are.
So I guess for people taking first steps, you could literally simply measure how much waste. Get a waste report from your waste contractor. You know, they can do this. In fact, legally, they should do this. But just ask them and put in the contract. You know, we just need to know what the weight and the different materials are that is our waste and what happens to them. So that's one easy request, and a very, it doesn't require any action really other than that request from a festival organizer, assuming you have one waste contractor dealing with all the waste for your site, of course. And the other easy win is fuel. How much fuel have you used? Again, that's a simple question to your energy contractor for site. And transport, well, it's been our experience that the best way to capture transport information is through our ticketing system. So that if you can do nothing else, those three important pieces of information will give you enough to start to work out your carbon footprint.
What about you, Chris? So from the work that you've done with Tyndall as well, and maybe some of the conversations you've had about bringing together this data, I think for an event organizer who's coming at this for the first time, where would you suggest they start?
I'll be a bit boring and say I think Chris has covered the main things. I think measuring, which sounds really boring, but it is really the only way you can know where you're starting from and where you're wanting to get to. And that can be as complicated or as simple as you want it to be. I'm sort of do climate change research, so I'm slightly prejudiced towards it, but I definitely think that CO2 emissions are the key urgent thing. So I think just having an understanding of the energy use, even if it's not a main part of your financial overhead, it will be the main part of your carbon overhead. So take big steps to measure it and control it. And having a renewable supply is a really positive thing, but that electricity has a carbon impact from it. So it's not the case that it's become zero carbon by having that great step to having a low carbon provider. There's still massive value in reducing electricity use, even once you've taken that step. And to do that, you need to have, as Chiara and Chris have said, you need to have the right measuring, and that can be fairly simple. I imagine Chris and Chiara could probably tell you how the best way to do that is at a festival, but definitely do that.
Brilliant, thank you, Chris. A question about actually local emissions and exceeding environmental limits. So air pollution really, and I think that's been one of the other drivers that we have very much seen, particularly for city centre events, around reducing the number of generators that are contributing to air pollution in city centres, and also traffic management. So the more people you can get out of cars, the less impact on local air pollution you're having, and it's sort of a win-win-win. I don't know whether you want to add anything to that, Chris Johnson.
No, but I do have a quote which I'd like to leave people with before you wrap up, if that's okay. This is Martin Luther, and I think I've got this right. He says, "Even if the world were to go to pieces tomorrow, I would still plant my apple tree." And I think in these times, it's really important to kind of end on a bit of a positive note, although we have had Biden, of course, which gives us a real sense that climate change might come back on the agenda. But that quote for me initially speaks to straightforward optimism. But when I think about it further, it's more than that, because that's how we choose to stand in the world. You know, in the face of everything, we can stand in the world in the right way and be proud of the contribution we can make. And I want to echo what Chris Jones said earlier. You know, I've always believed we have a profound, valuable and impactful role in the climate change conversation nationally and internationally as the music and events industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And absolutely, I would echo that. And, you know, I think the other thing as well is sometimes it feels like we are pushing a very heavy boulder up a very, very high hill, still trying to bend that curve on emissions. But just thinking back to my time in this space and how much the conversation has moved on in the past 8 years, and sort of how many more stories we have, I think, from the community, including a lot of people who are on this call, in terms of what you've made work, in terms of the fuel savings that you have achieved, in terms of the changes in the ways that you work, in terms of the coming together and the resourcefulness that has come out of this community. And I'm sure will continue to come out of this community. And I think the call to action for everyone is, the more that we shift this into our way of working, this is the commitment that we are making, that we want to contribute to a livable climate for us and for everyone, and sort of following that decision through to where it takes you, with courage and an open mind, and the occasional moment of frustration. But I think knowing that not a single person who's on this call today is alone. And with that, so thank you to Chris and to all of you for tuning in for the brilliant chat conversations that have been going on as well.